Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is April 9, year 2023, 6:46 p.m. PDT. And this is take two of an earlier talk I thought I was giving. Anyway, the audio went out around Mark 15. And since it's so late in the day, I'm going to just record this and then post it upon completing the talk, because I don't want to, I don't, in good conscience, want to keep people on the East Coast up into the wee hours. It is Easter Sunday, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you very much for the people on the live stream who notified me that the audio had gone out. I think what happened is that I went into some sort of coughing fit. I muted and forgot to remute. So anyway, I'll make sure that everything's in order before I repost it, because I know your time is valuable. So let's get right into it. You might have watched the first 15 minutes and know that this talk is based upon two academic books that were written on specifically on the death of Jane Stanford. Now, just writing about her life, her biography, would have been sufficient were it not for the fact that in addition to this, she died under mysterious or suspicious circumstances. And many people, including people in high levels of authority, claim that she was murdered. So it's a quite intriguing story that I've always been meaning to get back to, because I know the history of Stanford, and I got into it by retracing the history, especially in California, the state of California, the history of a term that we all know quite well by now. It's the term eugenics. Most of us have done our reading on it. And after the past 2.5 years, 3 years or so, we know how an eugenics agenda might be playing out in contemporary times. So we're not talking about exclusively an event that happened in the early part of the 20th century. We're talking about a larger agenda that is unfolding. And that's why I thought it was so important to revisit an otherwise fairly obscure Gilded Age crime, murder, mystery amongst the super elite. So what got me going on this project, restarting it, was a recent, well, it's fairly recent, 2022 published by a Professor Richard White. And the title of the book, sorry if I'm repeating myself from the earlier talk, Who Killed Jane Stanford, subtitled A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University. Sounds very exciting. And in addition to being sensational. Now, just as quickly, so far as the bona fides of the authors, this person here was on the medical school faculty at Stanford University, and this book here is published by Stanford University Press. That's not to say they had any undue influence on the editorial content. I'm just mentioning this in the effort to try to provide in this time available, the largest context possible to explain how these books come about, why they come about, and where they might be lacking. That's going to be my contribution today before we leave, and that's why I want to jump right back onto the vidcast while it was fresh on my mind. And this individual here is, well, he's an emeritus professor, but he also was a Stanford University faculty member, but he was in the history department. So you might say, and he hints at it, that Professor White has a better claim at the story of Jane Stanford because he has training as a historian. But and it's an excellent book. Don't get me wrong, but at the same time, I get the feeling that he's competing with his brother, who is a mystery writer, who probably sells a lot more. Academic books don't really sell. It's mostly for other academics. It's a very small subset of the reading population. But he was also trying to contextualize his book, his particular contribution, which is an important one. However, I don't think he went far enough. And in case my audio gets mysteriously cut off again, I will state at the outset that I think the biggest omission, and I only learned this by watching him on a show, I think it was produced by the Commonwealth Club of California. And you might recognize the name. It's a name associated with all the movers and shakers, not just of California, but people around the country and globally. Their name props up occasionally in reference to Bohemian Grove, for example, Bohemian Club. And they're not to say that all their membership are even aware of the skullduggery that takes place at these conclaves of the super elite. But in that talk, Professor White did allude to the fact that shortly before the death, or what many suspect was the murder of Jane Stanford, she was in serious talks with the Society of Jesus, who are very powerful in that area regionally. I'm talking about Santa Clara Valley, Northern California in particular. There's the University of San Francisco, which is a Society of Jesus institution. And then there is Santa Clara University, which is very close to Stanford University. It's part of it, I'm talking about University of Santa Clara. Part of it lies in Santa Clara County. And part of it is I believe, San Jose County. But the point is, it's in the heart of Silicon Valley. The massive wealth, the power, the technology that most of us are aware of right now. And it's said that, and I don't know if I agree with it. In fact, I would dispute the fact. And there's this notion being bandied about that he who controls AI will control the world. And I won't go into the reasons why I beg to differ. In a way, all this skullduggery is very human, even amongst those who are on the periphery of this particular academic community known as Stanford University. And it's something that AI itself is not going to be able to deal with, right? So that's a refutation of this notion of a universal, infallible AI as conceived by such promoters as Marvin Minsky of MIT, right? He's credited with being the so-called father of AI. And you and me, we can also, this is something that you can read through Kirby Summers' frequent dispatches on the Epstein file. The file's not closed. He might be dead, but the file is far from closed. But you might remember through her work that, and from other sources, right? I mean, it's not a secret, except to maybe the MIT PR department that would wish this information went away. But Marvin Minsky was also on that list, the Epstein list. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. So anyway, let me get into the heart of the matter here. First of all, that one point that I'm making right off the bat is that, let me see, am I muted? No, I'm okay. And the camera's running. That there's a possibility, this is my contribution, right? Because historians, quote unquote historians, academic historians, it's getting a little bit better now. Because we have a generation of younger people who have read some of the quote unquote conspiracy literature. But the old school, he's a emeritus professor, and like, you're not going to be writing about the Illuminati or the Society of Jesus or Saint Ignacio Loyola and talk about him being, a Morano or all the other stories as bloodlines, and you're not even going to get a job, let alone getting a tenured status at a Research One institution if you're in that direction. It's same with medical school. He's probably Dr. Cutler is probably more constrained, not by his profession, but through his own training. Okay, I guess this is sort of a self-flattering way of allowing me a space in this discussion here. Humble Professor Hamamoto, Professor Emeritus of the University of California, Davis, in that I am not bound by either of these constraints or any of these constraints. In fact, constraints for me are something that are to be challenged, right? Especially if I have the knowledge of the research, the background, the experience, the overall understanding, comprehensive synthetic, not meaning fake, but synthetic meaning a synthesis, a bringing together of different elements, disparate elements that don't necessarily go together at first sight, especially if you're trained with that, with the blinders, the academic blinders that are placed on you from the moment you are introduced to each other as first year grad students in the reception. It's fairly clear, whatever discipline you're in, that there's a reason why it's called a discipline. It's very narrow, and we all complain about it. Every single grad student or a professional uh, student, law student, L1, I guess it's called, or first year medical student, oh my gosh, it's so constrained and all that, and you make your peace with it or you don't, and some of us never quite adjust to these artificial barriers, especially when you're at an institution that calls itself a universe, right? University, right? Anyway, I promised I'd keep myself in check here and try to get this done because you've already sat through 15 minutes of talk before and 45 minutes of silence. Hopefully you tuned out before then. I might take down that video, by the way, but I might just leave up or re-edit it and just leave up the first 15 minutes. I don't know. The views don't really matter at this point because I'm not going to get very many no matter what, because TubeU makes sure that is impossible. They have a whole new generation now of YouTubers who are obviously professionally trained, highly skilled, which is wonderful, but most of the work and the research and the writing is done for them. So in essence, they're actors. So I don't want to compete on level. I can't compete on the level, and I don't really find the necessity to it because I'm presenting material here that they never would even dream about broaching on these sort of synthetic YouTube channel. By synthetic, I mean that in that sense, I mean fake, right? Because not too long ago, YouTube did have this window of opportunity for people who were doing original path-breaking work until it was realized how much money it makes in terms of advertising revenue. And it's also a lot of rich parents found out that, hey, I can get junior or juniorette a job in show business by buying her a YouTube channel. That's what they're doing in essence. And I won't feel so bad about having spent so much money sending her to Smith College and not getting much of a return on my investment. And she'll become a media celebrity, a influencer, if you will. Anyway, I'm just thinking out aloud and speculating. That's my competition from what I can tell. There's another element here that I also wanted to get out front. We already covered the Society of Jesus. I think Norman Panetta, if I'm not mistaken, remember him? Former secretary, was he Secretary of State? He was right. Clinton 2, Hillary Clinton, the Barama era. That Neon Panetta. He's a Californian. I think he comes out of Santa Clara College. There were a couple other movers and shakers who are also from that school, and it's a liberal arts college. I think they do graduate. They do have the PhD program that they offer, or the degree. I think they have a College of Law. I'm not really sure, but it's not a R1 or Research One institution like Stanford. So if the Jesuits had gotten a hold of it when they were in financial distress, by the way, it was not just institutional. Jane Stanford herself was not doing so well financially, and mostly because the institution they had founded in the memory of their deceased son, which I'll get to in a moment, was foundering financially. So whenever there is a crisis or a crisis to be had, you will find certain elements in history that tend to show up at opportune moments, opportune for them, not so much for us. Um, who knows what Stanford University would have been if it had turned Jesuit in 1901? And who knows? And I'm not imputing anything to any group, organization, religious, individual, nothing. Okay. But you have read the book by Phelps. Is it Michael John Phelps? Peter John Phelps? He has three names. So I can only remember two. But you know the book. It's called Vatican Assassins. I'll just refer you to that so you can look at the history there. But could it be that Jane Stanford ran afoul of one such assassin? She was assassinated. That much is clear. She was poisoned with strychnine, not once, but twice. First was in her Nob Hill home. For those of you who don't know, Nob Hill, even today, is this ultra ritzy area in San Francisco. It's a high on the hill to overlook all the peasants and the tourists. You think, oh, San Francisco, it's so wonderful. And then you have your gay community here that's having their fun, and all the different groups, who are so grateful to be in such a cosmopolitan city. And, who knows if they really know the dark history of their city for its day and to present. It's and I don't know how you would measure it on a comparative level, but it definitely, just because it's California, don't sell it short. It's one of the most corrupt cities of all time in the United States of America, then and now. And I've given talks alluding to that fact previously. Right? I've talked about Willie Brandt, who comes out of the University of California Law School. I told you a little about him. I talked about Kamala Harris, the historically Black college graduate and sorority sister. It's sort of like the female division of the Boule, right? The leadership of the African American community that makes sure that they ride herd over the Black underclass on the behalf of the white master, the white capitalist class. That's their function. Willie Brown, Kamala Harris, even people who don't realize that's what they're supposed to be doing, like LeBron James, whoever else, someone who's really doing right and understands the world and is smart and intelligent. He might be working as a sort of a professional athlete, entertainer, a minstrel, a Black gladiator of the present. But if he really strays beyond a certain boundary, him and his wife might find up dying in a helicopter accident, right? So these boundaries are patrolled very carefully, and one cannot rule out any sort of skullduggery where it comes to incredible wealth and power. And she had both. Her husband had political power. He was once the governor of California during the Civil War years. And she was already a multi-millionaire before then. And of course, after, and of course, he predeceased her, as the pattern goes. And so she had a couple decades being the sole beneficiary of his fortune and largesse, and therefore a person who would be targeted for elimination given the proper circumstances. And neither of these books deny what I am alluding to. Right. But the big mistake is to say, oh, this is a Miss Marple story. This is just sort of a murder victim. Oh, this sounds like Dashiell Hammett. No. That's one of the purposes of fiction, is so that when reality hits us in the face, we'll say, oh, yeah, it's the Black Dahlia all over again. Don't you love that movie? It's, Humphrey Bogart. We default into the familiar. So let's suspend that just for a moment. By the way, I love all that myself. Okay, I'm a Dashiell Hammett fan, Raymond Chandler. I like all the noir films of that period and some of the neo noir. I wish there was more of it instead of all this happy Disney pedo anime, sort of fake CG reconstructions that are leading us into supposedly singularity. See how easy it is for me to get diverted here. But I'm just warning you when I'm talking about this murder mystery. We're not talking about Richard White's brother who writes them. We're talking about history. We're talking about the reality of power in 2023, right? Fine and dandy, Leland Standard, the kingpin of railroad monopolies on the Pacific side. Wonderful. Andrew Carnegie. I mean, he's a peer, George Hearst, the money bags who died, I think, was it 20 years before Phoebe Apperson Hearst, left her a ton of gold, right? He literally was a gold miner. At least he was doing something, some physical labor. I think mostly. Well, anyway, I won't go into the pros and cons of criminal. The net result is the same. They both have power and money and influence, and they both have connections to premier institutions of higher learning that are running our world today in 2023. Otherwise, I wouldn't be interested. So, the other part of it, in addition, I've already mentioned the possible Society of Jesus connection. Well, actually, it's Professor White that mentions it, and I'm just teasing it out further because I'm not bound by constrictions as he is, right? You can believe it. There are Society of Jesus people who are on the corporation or the 44 members of the ruling board, whatever they call them there, right? Every university, private and public, has a council, the capo di capi, that they get together, and these are the people that run that state, and sometimes they're from out of state, but they're the real powers that be. They're not congressmen. They're usually on the boards and the corporations of these major universities. If you really want to understand power, and that's why I'm looking at the collegiate Gothic aspect of the power structure, as I call it. And more, I'm confirmed in my hypothesis that American society and culture and politics is in of itself Gothic, right? It's a inheritance from Britain. It didn't have to be. It could have been the city on the hill. It could have been all those dreams that we were taught about in grade school. I mean, there was that possibility. But instead, there were two courses that were taken. One was genocide, and I don't have to go into details about that, right? And as a result of that, I think it was in the late Republic or early Republic of America, maybe during the colonial periods, you had something called the Great Awakening. It's a massive, especially in upstate New York and the East Coast, you had an upsurge of religiosity and seeking for meaning amongst a certain group, mostly white, upper class, middle class, and bourgeois people. I'm not saying that you're African Americans or your Chinese coolies or your dirt Irish. I'm not saying dirt, in terms of disparity. I'm talking about in terms of class situation, because there were wealthy bourgeois Irish as well. But I'm talking about your average Irish immigrant. They were not involved in it. They were involved in trying to make a living, trying to exist. So this is a very class-specific crisis of conscience and spirit amongst the ruling class. So that was the Great Awakening 1. So let's leave that aside for a moment, and let's move to the Great Awakening 2. Why am I talking about American religious history? Let me tell you. All right. And no pre-knowledge of it is necessary. It will help. It will help you explain a lot of why America's so screwed up today, right? Because we have a social psychology that hasn't really been able to resolve the fact of the genocide. And the second part Oh, oops, I almost gave the middle finger. The second one, so there's 2 genocides. One was genocide. The second was autogenocide, and that was the Great American Civil War, where, um, I don't think ever think there has been a proper reckoning that has numbers given on the total casualties of the American Civil War. All we're told is that, that number far exceeds the total of World War American casualties. World War II, World War One, the Korean War, Vietnam War. In other words, it's huge and massive. So something like that is going to make a huge impact on the society, the culture, the politics, and the religiosity. And it was autogenocide. That's how I view it. I don't know if there's any historians or academic types who ever referred to the American Civil War as autogenocide, but I will. And I only came across that insight when I was trying to do the first part of this show. After I guess I had muted myself, or someone had muted me on my behalf. I don't know, but let's start thinking about Civil War as autogenocide because it keeps coming up again. Since it's in our literature, it's in our blood, really, and that doesn't mean if you're a recent immigrant that you're not party to it. No, no, you're an inheritor of that tradition. Our laws, the way corporations are formed, their unique culture, the religious institutions, all the significant, the major, including the university, the modern university, were forged in that crucible, right? Anyway, that's not the subject of today's topic. The reason that I'm mentioning the Second Great Awakening and the crisis that came out of the American autogenocide was the fact that there were a lot of, I think I call them crazy ladies, and don't get me wrong, this is not sexist. I'm saying crazy ladies because most of the men were dead. Yes, they perished in the Civil War. Isn't that what men do? They die so that so that the species supposedly can persist, and who's going to be responsible for that? That's women's, right? Of course, that's in the process of being re-engineered now at places such as Stanford University. But let me return to this larger point, right? The autogenocide known as the American Civil War resulted in the massive death of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands. I'm just going to put it in the abstract, right? Of real human beings who are the brothers or the husbands or the fiance of hundreds of thousands of women. That's why there was such a huge widow. I won't call it a problem, but there's a huge widow population following the American Civil War. And a lot of them, by the way, went into teaching. Before that used to be primarily a male occupation, and they also were able to move into quote unquote male professions. So there was a benefit there, but it was a benefit created out of necessity. And this is where a lot of your social reformers, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Beecher Stowe, they come from these families that have roots back to the American Civil War, and the women in of a certain class in a certain racial group, and Protestant primarily, there are probably a few Catholic women there, but mostly Protestant, were the beneficiaries of this population decrease amongst their menfolk, and so they had to take these functions on. At the same time, they meaning these upper middle class white women primarily, had the means, the wherewithal, and the inclination to explore, as part of the Second Great Awakening, this whole movement called Spiritism or spiritualism. I've heard it used in same context, but in two different camps: Spiritism and spiritualism. And before your eyes glaze over, we're not talking about, yeah, I'm a spiritual, but we're not, forget about the New Age stuff just for a moment. Although the New Age does bear very strong traces of this Second Great Awakening. And we're talking about the late Victorian age up until the early 20th century, right? So there are elements there that's relevant to 2023 that we might not recognize. And if I don't forget, I'll try to point out at least one thinker who also comes out of Stanford, who represents this so-called new revolution in thinking, right? It's beyond, and this is Easter Sunday, okay? It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk today. It's supposedly beyond, they don't say this, but it's supposed to be beyond Christianity, but it's all religions. It brings Hinduism, Catholicism, all the different Protestant denominations, Jainism. I mentioned not too long ago Baha'i religion, which is a very fast growing religion currently, originating in Iran. I didn't really get into it that extensively, but we're seeing some signs of revival or people pushing into this area, telling us this is the next big thing, right? So this is very much within the American grain, to borrow a phrase from a literary critic here, right? So Spiritism was very much a part of the lives of people of that era we're talking about, including Leland and Jane Stanford, the ultimate power couple. Let me show you what I mean. This is from a local ABC network affiliate here in Sacramento. Sacramento's quite haunted, believe me, I live here.
I'm Amy Gomez in Sacramento.
There was an employee in front of me, and she went into the hallway, and something caught my eye, and it was an image of maybe a party goer. It was somebody that was dressed up.
Casey Hayden has been the director of the Stanford Mansion for over a decade. He says he's not the only person who works at the museum who's experienced something paranormal. But considering the history behind these walls, it comes as no surprise.
Elin Sr.'s mother died here.
It all started after the tragic death of the only son of Leland Sr. and Jane Stanford in 1883. Leland Stanford Jr. died of typhoid fever at the age of 15. It is said his mother tried to contact her dead son through seances. Another incident that changed the course of history happened shortly after Leland's death. While his father was sleeping, some say the son's ghost appeared at night asking him to establish a school, which he did, and it eventually became Stanford University. Meanwhile, the family donated the mansion to the Sisters of Mercy, who then turned it into an orphanage.
This side replicates what it would have looked like in the early 1900s when the small kids were here.
Sometime in the 1940s, a fire started on one of the 44 floors, and Hayden says a small child died in the home. He's not sure if it was connected to the fire. Today, the mansion is a state historic park and museum. It's open 7 days a week and offers free tours. Mady Gomez, ABC 10 News. I'm Mady Gomez in Sacramento.
There you have
Something
it.
caught my eye, and it was.
Sorry about that. The next time you're in Sacramento, be sure to visit it. Now, I have a confession to make. I have never been to the Stanford Mansion Museum, but now I'm going to go, especially when I know about its different purposes through history, including that of an orphanage and its mysterious burning of a child in one of the. She misspoke. There's not 44 stories. I think there's only 5 or 6, but there are 44 rooms, and that used to be the personal residence of Leland Stanford and his wife, Jane. And as I told you before, he was governor. So I don't know if he was living in the governor's mansion or if they even had a governor's mansion. This is probably in the days before that. He was living in this private residence. And you know who the current governor is. It's American Psycho, right? Gavin Newsom. So you can see that there's that history that they had with them in San Francisco, and they also had it up. They brought the that sort of eerie Gothic history up to them when they moved to San Francisco in Nob Hill. She was poisoned. She had the presence of mind to make sure that her stomach was pumped, and she had enough servants around who were able to get her to the hospital or I can't remember the story. It was a private physician that had his personal stomach pumper. But they did test the glass of water. It was mineral water. In fact, I know the brand is called Poland water. It's still, that brand is still around. And they found some residue, and it was definitely strychnine. So the second time, and after that, she wanted Jane Stanford wanted to move out and never come back, and so she decided to go visit some friends in Hawaii because that's where all the Yale colonial people of her social class took over from the what they were called Kanakas back then, and they're Asian people. My ancestors are from there, working in the cane fields and picking pineapple and the plantation, right? So she went over there and she was poisoned again, but this time it worked. That is, she died. So the big question is, who done it? Um, Professor White claims he knows who did it, and it's really not for me. It's so much important as who done it as to why done it and who cui bono. We've heard that phrase before. It wasn't just one person who was going to get a day off because her mistress or master died, right? Supposedly, this woman who's the chief suspect of being the murderess had a mother who was sick, and then she didn't want to go with Jane Stanford to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii they were going to go on a tour to Japan. By the way, the Stanford loved the Japanese culture and society. They did not like the Japanese, however, but they liked the society and the culture. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, we love your food. We love your anime. We are the weeaboos. We'll tell you what's cool. We love your video games. But Fukushima, watch out, man, because we're still very suspicious of you, and we're watching. Anyway, the point is that she got her comeuppance, as some might say, because there are a lot of people who want to kill her. And again, it was strychnine, and then it was found. David Starr Jordan, who was the inaugural president, that means first, of Stanford University, took the steamboat over there. There was no air line. I don't think there were commercial airplanes really functioning then. So he took the steamship out of San Francisco to Hawaii, and seems like he took care of matters. He was a cleanup man. And by the time he left, it was no longer a murder. It was no longer a suicide, because a suicide would cause an investigation, which would gum up the works so far as the Stanford Trust is concerned, and all the monies that are associated with her, and how they're going to pay the faculty, right? And there were issues with that already, right? Which I don't need to go into. It's not very interesting to anybody unless you're an academic yourself. But it seems like she paid him out of her own purse. And if you were on her good side, she'll pay you good money. But if you weren't, then she'll pay you like her Chinese servants, like Awa, who was one of the suspects, by the way, of a murder. Right? What's a murder mystery in San Francisco unless a Chinaman is one of the suspects of it? But he got out of it, right? By the way, when I used the word China back then, that was not considered to be a racial slur. It's a China man from China, okay? And it was a descriptor that was, not really meant to demean anybody, although I wouldn't suggest calling a Asian American or a Chinese person today, especially in the US. You could probably get away with it in China because they don't know what you're talking about. But if you did today, you might be in trouble. So anyway, those are in the days, this is in the days of the postbellum, the the racial order and the hierarchy was pretty well established there, and it was established all the way through World War II. In fact, before I forget, I think I want to run this little clip here to show you that the dream of Stanford University wasn't enjoyed universally by everybody that was in there. Let's see here. Okay, I won't bore you with this part. I didn't have that queued up properly, but you get the idea of that's a Stanford University production, and that's part of their self perception in the 21st century. I think one of their big dubious achievements was they Stanford faculty voted to. I remember the battle. It was many, many years ago, but they did away with something called Western civilization. Right. This was the sort of the leading edge of the whatever you feel about it, and I'll use this expression for the lack of anything better, but for the decolonization of the curriculum at the American university. And I for one, uh, don't really dispute it. I'm not going to promote it, but I'm also not going to stand in the way, right? Um, and I'll give you the reason why. Is because Dave, David Starr Jordan, was one of the founding members of the Americans eugenics movement. That's what got me interested in Jane Stanford. I said, "Oh, I was reading about David Starr Jordan for my own courses in Asian American history, and Asian Americans have a very strong and vital presence then and now in California state history and U.S. national history, even though by watching mainstream media, except for Connie Chung or so and so, some token or some network executive's girlfriend or something, you're not going to see much of a presence there, which is intentional. But so I well understood David Starr Jordan, what he represents in terms of the larger racial politics that have shaped America in its two great awakenings, right? And the two major genocides, and the third one that's ongoing right now, biogenocide. We're in a new phase, right? You're hearing this here on YouTube of all places, right? We're going through the third phase. So we need a third great awakening, but it better not be this new age garbage or this we're all brothers and sisters under the skin and it's mostly material that comes out of guess what, Stanford University, Yale, you name it, all the major centers that said, oh, we're getting away from the colonial business now. What they didn't tell you is that now they're heavily in the biocolonial industry. Why else would I be revisiting some murder that really doesn't bother me? One is just another super wealthy person that's dead, and I'm not one of her beneficiaries in the will. If I was all wing, then maybe I would be interested, right? But that's not the case here. So, what makes me say that there was a metaphysical, to put it more objectively, but a let's say a less than, I'll just say an evil dimension to the founding of Stanford University. And no, it's not because of the murder of Jane Stanford. This is the realization I had by reading these books. And there are a bunch of academic articles as well. And there's anecdotal. I read articles from Stanford Magazine. It's published by Stanford University Magazine. It's for alumni, right? Make sure that the money keeps getting donated, right? It's a very well done publication. And there is, in fact, a whole article, and I won't have time to go through it now, but I'll post it on my Patreon page. But it's a really nice article about the Stanford couple and their involvement with seances, as I've already mentioned, right? People of their social status, class, their background were flocking to these magicians, seers, Seers, not Sears and Roebuck, but people with mystical powers. And they suppose, this is the cover story, they supposedly went to see one because their son, Leland Stanford Jr., died at age 15. Not in America, just like Jane Stanford, he died not in America, Jane Stanford died in a territory of America, Hawaii, but it was not in America. He was out of jurisdiction. He died in Italy, supposedly, I think, of tuberculosis. But was it tuberculosis? I don't know. Because we know that David Starr Jordan went over there and made sure that he got the type of findings, the official findings he wanted from not just the Hawaii police, but the San Francisco Police Department, all the officials. So it turned out to be some sort of a coronary embolism. So I can't remember what the official reason was. Everybody knew it was murder, but the official record was going to state that she died not of suicide, because they didn't want to tie up any sort of monies for the university while her estate was being settled, right? And I think there might be causes for suspicion of the death of their son. In fact, he might be a human sacrifice. I'll go so far as I might be. Notice that I qualify that with might be. And that's for an intrepid researcher to follow up this whole historical trajectory and understanding the families, the bloodlines of people who rise to such heights. It is not uncommon for them to sacrifice a child in order to make sure that their hand is fully in the Luciferian contract, right? They don't necessarily know when they're going to have to deliver on it, right? And eventually Lucifer said, okay, age 15, here you go. And the boy is, almost in adulthood. He was, from what I've read, brilliant, smart. He was the heir apparent, but he died despite the best medical care and attention available to any human being on earth, given their wealth. He died. So what is the cause of my suspicion? All right. And I think maybe I'll end at this point, because I want to raise questions more than answer anything about the death of Jane Stanford, which in it of itself is not of any great interest to me. It's of historical importance, somewhat, but the real money that made Stanford University of today is the money that came during World War II, or the lead up to World War II and through the post-war period, where the Pentagon took over the U.S. government and made universities vassal states of its operation. That's where we're at today in 2023. So what was the clue that I am proceeding from? And this comes from this book. It's the older of the two books by Dr. Cutler here, medical doctor Robert W.P. Cutler, The Mysterious Death of Jane Stanford. Leland Stanford, busy executive, a business person, right, mover and shaker. He took off for a business trip. It was to last about 3 weeks. His home base, as we've already seen by this clip, his home base was Sacramento, California. And I'll start reading verbatim from here, so you know I'm not making this up or paraphrasing. Quoting, on his return to Sacramento, according to legend, Leland asked Jane to organize a dinner for their closest friends so that they might introduce Leland Jr. I'm going to interject right here. He was a newborn, right? He was a newborn. Continuing, after the guests were seated, a butler entered carrying a large covered silver platter and placed it at the center of the table. To Mrs. Stanford's astonishment, the governor raised the lid to reveal their infant supine on a bed of flower petals, and he asked to take the tray with the smiling neonate around to each guest, showing on their left, one presumes, as if serving the entree. And it concludes, trying to play off the gruesome visuals here. The story is beyond belief, but like others to be encountered, it found its way into California history. Oh, yeah, it's just some more wacky California history. You know how it's the land of fruits and nuts. But obviously, there was some sort of account that was either written or printed or repeated, and the person who wrote this book saw that it was important enough to record in the early pages of this biography. But to me, that sounds like human sacrifice, or at least a ritual that's meant to emulate or simulate the human sacrifices. Not that I have any personal knowledge, I just know as much as you, having watched YouTube and all the different Rothschild type parties and spirit cooking. We've heard all this stuff, but this is going down in what, 1868? This is American Civil War time, right? And just because it was early on in our history doesn't mean that we're, as a people, were more naive. In fact, we might have been a little bit more obvious. We, meaning certain segments of the population, might be more obvious of their class privilege. Right. So anyway, this is something to think about. I want you to check this book out yourself and read it if you want to take it that far. But you'll have to keep this in mind, that the case is not closed about regarding the death, the murder of Jane Stanford. Right. And the reason why, in closing, why I'm revisiting this seemingly cold case is that I would argue that these really malign, malignant, evil energies that were put onto this earth, that came through this portal, if you want to call it some sort of ritual or some sort of events, seances, but they came on this earth. And that is really the basis of what I call the haunting of Stanford University that persists to this 2023. And its number one progenitor is no longer, of course, Leland Stanford. He's been swapped out many times. There have been many Leland Stanfords swapped out by Lucifer since the deal was cut back in the late Victorian, or the Victorian age, really. It was still prime Victorian age. And I think there might have been British agents involved, I should say, not in passing. That almost slipped my mind. Why do I say that? She was surrounded by British trained butlers, British trained nurses. She had all these Chinese servants around her, because this is in San Francisco, after all. There were not very many black servants available out here, so they used Chinese. But the ones that were the real servants, supposedly loyal to them, were these British trained. And one of them had even been the personal servant to, or butler to, the great escort, Lily Langtry. The name might not mean to any, but she was big stuff back in the 19th century. So there's always the possibility of a British connection in the murder of Jane Stanford. Okay. So we see many manifestations of that. The haunting comes from the simulated ritual sacrifice of Leland Stanford Jr., which we know took place according to this historical source. We know that their mansion was haunted. We know that there were people who wanted to kill Jane Stanford, not once, but twice. The second time they succeeded. I don't know if the old man himself died of a natural death. I tend to suspect not, right? But the quest goes on, and it's being channeled through the portal called Stanford University, and probably its most visible exponent of that, purposely, he's put out there so that we'll fasten on his image, is someone that you know, and I know quite intimately, because he won't let us forget that he exists, even if he has to buy Twitter. And his name is Elon Musk. He's also a Five Eyes guy. He's also a guy that comes out of the British network. So, which is another reason why that's something that we need to be cognizant of and vigilant of. And he himself has operationalized, if you want to call it that, a program called Valis, which was written about by PKD, Philip Dick. You know that I've been writing about him and researching his life because it's very Bay Area, it's very Stanford to UC Berkeley, access down to Yo-Yo-Dine down in Southern California, Orange County. Talk about Orange County, especially back then, you're talking about Yo-Yo-Dine. That's Thomas Pynchon's kind of joke about the military-industrial complex in beautiful Orange County where Disneyland is, right? Yeah, they gave us Disneyland because I grew up in Anaheim partly. They give us Disneyland, but they're also giving us Hellwrecker, right? That's Hughes aircraft and all that stuff. I had people that worked there. My playmates, my schoolmates, their dads all worked for so-called aerospace and defense, right? My mother did, in fact, at a low level. She was in customer service. She was really good. Customers liked her. They liked to talk to her. She's the friendliest, nicest person you'll ever meet. So anyway, the system's called VALAS, VALAS, and it stands for, this is why I mentioned Elon Musk, it stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. Once more, Vast Active Living Intelligence Systems, right? And what it is, it's describing is that whole satellite array that Wonder Boy, Elon Musk frontman, Wonder Boy and his witchy woman, that's probably the real brains behind the operation. He's got him up there in his satellites. Right? It's supposed to improve 5G and the internet, but according to this, it's also to enforce behavior, to dictate behavior. It's not just a matter of communication. It's about, well, you know all the dystopian implications of it. I don't have to remind you, even though that most of us are freely indulging and have contracted and to have agreed to allow the Luciferian 5G technology into our lives and embrace it, right? Okay, I'm going to leave off for now, and I'm going to explore this thread. I'd like, if you would, comment upon your thoughts, and if you have knowledge about spiritualism of the 19th century, spiritism, please put that down there. I'm interested in what was back then called spirit photography. You've seen this, right? Mary Todd Lincoln, this is Abraham Lincoln's wife. She was totally into it because her son had died. So you could see pictures of her with ghosts or people in her circle of these other spirits. And some people say it's fraud. Some people say it's some kind of lens anomaly. There's all kinds of reasons for it. But the point is that there were lots and lots of people who had bought in to spiritualism in different manifestations. One of them, by the way, is Arthur Conan Doyle. You know, I knew him as a kid and as an adult from Sherlock Holmes, and he wrote other stories that didn't have to do with Sherlock Holmes. I know that. I listened to a lot of them. They're almost all of them are in an audiobook. But I really gained respect for him as an intellectual when I found this book by him about the occult. It's the history of the occult. Not that he himself was an occultist, but he studied it very closely. So he talks about spiritualism in there, and that really helped me. And he also seemed to have pretty good course. He's British, of course, or English if you prefer. He had close contact with people in America, his counterparts. So it was a lively, robust intellectual tradition that was in formation that has not gone away. And I've already mentioned in other talks that none other than William James at Harvard University was also involved with spiritualism. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. which I didn't fully understand when I first read it, but now I understand that this is part of a larger social political movement in Anglo-America. And again, this is an original, I think it's an argument original to me, or it's a hypothesis. I think it was stimulated by the heavy guilt, Christian guilt, I think, because most of these people were professed some sort of Protestant denomination, like David Starr Jordan and the Hearst family, as well as the Stanfords, they loved humanity, but they were eugenicists nonetheless. They loved people in the abstract, but they were supporting the human. I'm talking about David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford, who had a hand in the murder of his boss, Jane, if you haven't figured that out by now, right? He had a hand in it. But he was one of the co-founders of the Human Betterment Society. Remember the Human Betterment Society? I gave a talk on the Pasadena Rosicrucian Tournament of Roses. That's a redundancy, but I'm saying that just so you'll get it, and then you'll start rethinking what that yearly ritual really means. What are roses but an ideal hybrid of a certain species? And isn't that what the eugenics agenda is all about? Right. And you have the fair virginal maidens who are being put on parade. And these are the rose princesses or princii. One of them gets to be the queen. And I sense maybe the queen gets to mate with the king. I don't know. But it's not just fun and games as we see during the run-up to the Rose Parade. There is a core metaphysics there that the people who are supporting that, not supporting it, because they're the people who put the roses on, they don't know what's going on. They go to the parade. But the people who are really behind these huge, giant occultic rituals, it's for their benefit. And they're drawing the energy from you and me, Mr. and Mrs. Joe, television, YouTube viewer, Super Bowl halftime viewer. That's what we're being sucked into. And that's the same show that we're being lured into by Elon Musk. All right. So just keep that in mind. This talk here, hopefully you understand, has a practical import. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's my talk for Easter Sunday. It's now 7:49. I don't even know how long I've gone. Sounds like I've been talking all day. Oh, I went another hour. Okay, you got some bonus here material. And I might have missed out some parts here, but I'm sure I'll return to these themes from time to time. But overall, I'm very happy. I'm kind of glad that the audio went on the first talk, assuming that this one is okay, because it allowed me to clarify my ideas a little bit better. All right, I'm going to end it now then, and I'll post this later today after ensuring that it's suitable for podcasting. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. Happy Easter. My gosh, we're in a world of trouble, but guess what? We will emerge from this okay. We have always in the past. It's always seemed to be so dark before the dawn. So let us remember on this Easter Sunday that, yes, not only is there hope, there is redemption. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you soon, God willing. Bye.